Hello everyone. Welcome to Character Animation Bootcamp Orientation. In this orientation lesson, we're just going to look at some very basic stuff about working with rigged puppets in After Effects. Throughout this course, you're going to be provided with puppets already rigged for you so we can focus on movement and animation. But some of you may not be familiar with working with these kinds of puppets. So for those of you that haven't worked with a rigged puppet with controllers, we want to talk through some basic terminology and some basic techniques. Let's begin by talking about IK and FK. FK stands for forward kinematics, and IK stands for inverse kinematics. FK is actually something that you're probably already familiar with if you've done any parenting in After Effects or really any other animation software. We have a really basic FK chain set up here on arm A, and let's just look through this so we understand what we're talking about. We've got an arm here separated into three separate parts. We have a hand, and you'll notice that the anchor point of the hand is set at the wrist. We have a forearm with the anchor point set at the elbow, and we have an upper arm with the anchor point set at the shoulder. Now these three layers have been parented together, the hand to the forearm to the upper arm, so that now we have a forward kinematic chain. And the way this works is very simple. If we rotate the top part of the arm, the forearm and the hand also move. And then if we rotate the forearm, the hand also moves. And then we can rotate the hand individually. And this is a functional way to rig a limb, but it does have some limitations. For one thing, I have to animate attributes on three separate layers in order to get my animation to happen, and I have to select different layers back and forth in order to pose each part. By the time you add in two arms, two legs, a body, and a head, and eyes, and a mouth, and feet, and all that kind of stuff, this tends to be a very clunky way to work. And it becomes very difficult to manage the animation having to work with keyframes spread across so many different layers. So this is a functional way to work, but it's not really the most efficient way to work for our purposes. So instead, we want to use inverse kinematics. And inverse kinematics is a system that allows us to essentially fix a position at the top part of a parented chain and a position at the bottom of the parented chain, and have them move independently of one another while the parts in the middle move automatically. Now, creating inverse kinematics takes a tremendous amount of complicated math and scripting, but thankfully we now have tools like Duik that allow us to add IK systems to rigs in After Effects really quite easily, and Duik really does all of the hard work and all of the scripting and all of the crazy math for us. So we've got an arm here that's rigged using Duik tools, and this is also a chance for us to talk about the kind of process we'll be using to pose and animate our figures as we move through this course. Because we are no longer going to be clicking on individual layers of artwork as we did here with our FK chain. With an IK chain and an IK rig, we're no longer actually clicking on artwork. In fact, you can see that the artwork has been shied and locked away, so I can't actually click on it at all. Instead, I have these null controllers visible on the screen, and I can click on these. These null controllers are now what we will use to control this arm puppet. Now the way I'm going to do this is also significant because this is another process we're going to be using throughout this course. And this is a little different from what you may be used to working with attributes in the timeline. Now, I still work with the attributes in the timeline as well, and as we move through the class, you'll see me move back and forth between these techniques. But for the most part, with a well-rigged puppet, you can use a little more of an intuitive process to pose and animate your characters. And that is just simply using the ordinary selection tool. And if you happen to have another tool selected, you can hit the V key to automatically toggle to the plane arrow tool. And what we're going to do is we're just going to click and drag on these controllers. And I've got a hand controller right here, and I'm going to click and drag on that, and you can see now the result of our inverse kinematic chain. Now, ignore this motion path for a minute. I've got some animation on here that we're going to look at later, and just focus on what the arm is doing and how I'm controlling it. I'm moving the hand around, but the shoulder, the top of this IK chain, is staying in a fixed position. So now I can move the hand around in this very intuitive, natural way, and it naturally moves both of the limbs in the chain based on the position of this hand. If I want to rotate the hand, I simply hold down the W key, and that toggles my tool to the rotation tool temporarily, and it allows me now to rotate and pose the hand. And so I can click and drag to position, hold down the W key, and click and drag to rotate. And this is a wonderfully intuitive way of working with puppets in After Effects. It's like posing a little action figure or a little doll. So it's a very intuitive and quick way to work. And the other thing that's really fantastic about this is that rather than controlling the movement over 3 different layers with 3 different attributes, I'm controlling the movement of all 3 of these layers with simply 2 attributes on 1 layer. So I immediately have reduced my screen real estate issues. I've got easier copying and pasting and editing, all because of this much more intuitive and simple IK system. The other nice little thing we have rigged in here is that we can return to our neutral position simply by zeroing out the values on these 2 attributes. So bringing those attributes back to 0 brings us back to our neutral position. All right, and then because this is an IK system, I can also click and drag on this controller that's controlling the shoulder. Now, in a full-fledged, full-figure rig, this would actually be parented to the torso or to the center of gravity of the character. But in this case, I just have a simple controller on here. But you can see now that as that moves around, the hand also stays in place. So this is a much more intuitive way to pose and control the figure, and is particularly useful with legs and feet, as we'll see when we begin working with Stretch's rig in just a little bit. So IK is a really, really great way to work. And for about 80–90% of the time, an IK system is all you're going to need to get the job done. So let's look at just a couple more things about this rig before we move on and look at our other example. So I'm going to select the main controller here, the hand controller, and I'm going to open up the effects controls. You might want to do this too if you're following along with me. And I'm just going to move my effects controls panel over to the side here so it'll stay up while we're working. And you'll notice that with that hand selected, I can see that there's a couple of additional controls attached to this null controller. These are created by Duik Tools when it adds the scripting to create the IK chain, and we'll look at that in more detail in a later lesson. But I just wanted to point out one of the basic controls that you are going to want to work with almost immediately, and that is the IK orientation. So if I pick up and move the hand in this way, I want the elbow to bend this direction. That would be normal. But there are going to be times where the way I'm posing the figure, I'm going to want the elbow to bend back the other direction. And in that case, that is what the IK orientation is for. And if I uncheck this, the checked box means it's in its default position, which is set when you create the rig. But I can now check that, uncheck that, and you can see now it switches the orientation of the IK back in the other direction. This is sort of the 2D equivalent of a pole vector in 3D computer animation, if any of you have any familiarity with that. It's fairly simplistic, but it does give you the ability to change the direction of that bend. So the other control, the goal, we'll talk about that later. That's not anything that we'll really need to worry about for these early lessons. All right, so IK is great, and quite frankly, you're going to use it about 80–90% of the time, particularly with legs and feet, pretty much all the time with legs and feet. However, there are certain types of animation, in particular when you're doing a lot of smooth overlap and follow through with arm movements, waving an arm back and forth, for example, or creating a swinging arm in a walk cycle is another good example. In those instances, you may want some of the advantages of FK. What I've done is I've put together just a little bit of animation on all three of these arms here, and let's just go ahead and RAM preview that quickly. And what I've basically done is created identical animation with these three different rigs in order for us to kind of talk about the subtle differences here. Now, this is not an extreme example, so the IK only arm here is actually doing a perfectly fine job of carrying out this little piece of animation. But if you look very, very carefully, you'll see that the FK arm, if you just focus on arm A for a minute, is quite a bit smoother. It's a more of a smooth sense of overlap and follow through. It feels a little more natural. Whereas the B arm feels just a little bit more jerky, just a little bit stiffer. Okay, and let's take a look at why. So focusing on arm A first, let's look at these blue layers here. I'm hitting the U key, by the way, to open up all the animatable attributes on this layer. And we can see our rotation animations. They all start in the same place, but you'll notice that they are staggered as they come to their final resting place. This is part of what's creating our sense of overlap and follow through here, is that first the upper arm reaches its final position, then the forearm reaches its final position, and then finally the hand reaches its final position. And that gives us that offset, that overlap that we like to see in animation. So that's how that is created, and it works very nicely. It's very smooth. Now I'm also getting some drag here on the hand, and the drag on the hand, which helps to really sell the overlap and follow through, that is created by manipulating the motion graph of the rotation value on the wrist there. So that's dipping down a little bit, dragging that back before that comes up and flips back around to its final resting place. If you're not yet familiar with using the motion graph editor, we've got a little crash course video that you can watch that will take you through the basics. So this creates a really nice effect. It's very smooth, soft movement. But as we discussed, this is not the optimum way to rig something, especially for speed and efficiency. So moving on here to our IK chain, you can see that once again, we're getting the job done, but it is a little bit stiffer, and it is giving us this little bit of wobble in the upper arm there. So let's have a look at this. So here we have our two position and rotation values, and that's really the secret as to why this isn't quite as smooth as the FK only version. And that's because I'm no longer driving each part individually, so I'm not able to create that smooth overlap from part to part. basically I'm getting the speed and efficiency of being able to control all three parts with one controller, but I'm losing a little bit of the fine-tuning ability of that part-to-part control gives us. So you can see here that I've shaped my motion curve here to arc up and out, and that is also creating a little bit of a problem because that's creating our little wobble in the upper arm. And if you watch closely, as this moves upward, it's pushing back on that elbow, so the elbow is first swinging back a little bit and then swings forward as the arc picks up. Now, the truth is here, with a little bit of finessing, I could minimize or possibly completely eliminate that little wobble. But it would definitely take some finessing. I'd have to sit and monkey with this motion path a little bit before I got that to work. So this might be a situation where you might prefer FK. Now again, 80–90% of the time IK is going to get the job done quicker and faster and be much more efficient. So generally you're going to want to choose this, but you are going to find times when that FK advantage is going to, you're going to really want that little advantage and that extra control that FK gives you. Well, here's where Duik comes to the rescue for us again, because now as of the last couple of versions of Duik, he includes an IK-FK switch option that you can add to your rigs. So let's go ahead and look at hand C here. I'm going to go back to frame 0, and because I've actually got a change in that switch once our animation begins. So when I select this hand, you'll see that we've got an additional set of controls on this hand in order to have our IK-FK switch. So to start with here, it works exactly like our IK hand. We have our full IK, so we get all that wonderful efficiency of being able to control everything with one controller and a couple of values. So that's great. But this gives us the option at will in the midst of an animation to switch off the IK system and make it an FK system once again. So here's the way that works. You simply uncheck the IK-FK switch, and then now the controller now does nothing. It's kind of rendered null and void for the moment. And instead, these three controls take over. The upper FK, which controls the shoulder, the lower FK, which runs the elbow, and the end FK, which operates the wrist. So I can now animate those three values and create my my more smooth overlapping animation without having to switch to a different rig or unrig or give up on having that useful IK for most of the time. So this, in this case here, I basically reanimated that same control, that same animation, excuse me, as I did in the FK rig here, and you can see I got that same smoothness. And what's also awesome about this is that all of those controls are all contained on one layer. So that makes working with them, editing them, and copying, pasting them much, much easier. So the IK-FK switch that Duik provides for us is really, really a wonderful, handy tool. And we are going to be using it off and on throughout the class. Okay, the next thing that we want to look at is Stretch's rig and start to look at working with a more full-fledged rigging system. So let's switch over to the Stretch rig. If you're following along with me, you'll want to do the same. This is Stretch. This is the first of the two characters we're going to be working with for the first couple of exercises in Character Animation Boot Camp, Squash and Stretch. This is Stretch, the tall blue one, and the short, squat, orange one is Squash. So we're going to be working with Stretch here for this first little lesson, and for the evaluation exercise, you're going to be working with Squash. Now, we've stripped this down a little bit and we've pulled his arms off. Don't worry, we can put them back on easily. But we want to just start you guys with something very, very simple and not too confusing to begin with. So the first thing I'm going to do is rearrange my window a little bit here, because this is not really the most efficient way to animate characters. Now, because we have a really simple rig here, this is maybe not as critical, but I want to get you guys started using good practices right from the beginning. And this particular window arrangement is much more efficient for most character animation in After Effects. Now, I've actually got this as a preset, saved as a preset, and I recommend you do the same. I'll kind of walk you through how I set it up first, just so you can see how I do it. And you, of course, are welcome to modify it however you wish, but I'll just show you what I do. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of the panels that I don't need and won't be using for the most part. So then I'm going to rearrange this so I get the maximum amount of vertical real estate for my timeline. So I'm going to pull the composition window down and stick it to the side here, and then I'm going to take my effects control and stick that in the middle. Then I want my info window and I want my preview window, and I really don't need the audio window. That's another one that we can close for now. And then finally, I'm going to take the project window, because I'm also not really going to be working with that right now, and I'm going to drop that on top of the timeline windows, so that just becomes compressed in there and becomes a tab there. And then now I have this large amount of screen real estate that I can provide for my timeline. And when I select and open these attributes, now this is just a few of the attributes on these characters. If I was to open all the attributes on these character rigs, it would easily fill up this screen. And once you start working with that many attributes, when you have to work with them in tandem, you're going to want all of this real estate on your screen. And generally, most characters, not all certainly, but most characters tend to be a little taller than they are wider. So generally, this works just fine for our viewing window. Although, of course, our own Squash character is a little more wide than he is tall. But still, the advantage of having the vertical real estate for your timeline, it's still worth it. So this is the way we're going to be working for most of the time in this class. If you want to save this as a preset, I've actually already done so, but if you wanted to save this as your own preset, just go up under the workspace pull down and select new workspace, and then it'll just ask you to give that a name, and it'll become available to you in the pull down menu here. It's really nice and simple. Let's take a look at Stretch's rig. We've actually disabled quite a few parts of the rig for now, so we're just going to start you with 3 basic controllers. We've turned his arms off, and we've turned off the arm controllers and the eye controls for now. Please just leave those alone. We will get to those in the next video. Our first control is the cog, and the cog, as you can see, allows us to move the main part of his body. COG stands for center of gravity, and you can see that its pivot point, its anchor point, is right at his pelvis. So as we pivot him, as we move him around, he's moving around, pivoting on his center of gravity. Now, in a more fully rigged character, this would be controlling the torso, the head, the arms, and all the entire upper part of the body would all be controlled by the cog. So you'll also notice that the IK chains built into the leg rigs are showing why they work so great, which is that they're keeping the feet on the ground, so that as I move him around here, his feet stay on the ground, giving us that illusion of weight and gravity. And it also means we don't have to do any crazy counter keying between the positions of the feet and the positions of the torso. So this is once again very, very intuitive, easy way to work. And just like all of our controllers, we can zero out the values to return that to neutral. All right, the next controller we want to look at is the foot controller. Both of the foot controllers are identical, so we'll just take a close look at one. And that allows you to click and drag and lift and move the foot position around, and also rotate the foot, again by holding down that W key to toggle to rotation. Aside from the basic control of positioning the foot, we also have a couple of additional controls here that we want to look at. In particular, we want to look at the heel roll. The heel roll is incredibly important for walks and runs, but it also makes all kinds of complicated animations with the feet and legs easier to deal with. Now there's a really important thing we have to remember about the heel roll that I want to talk to you about here, and that is when to use the heel roll and when not to use the heel roll. One of the things that you want to do is always remember to only use the heel roll when the foot is on the ground, okay? When the foot is planted on the ground, that's the time to use this heel roll. You can even use it backwards here if he's hanging off the edge of a step or something. But the idea is that his foot should be on the ground. Now when his foot is on the ground, the foot controller should have a rotation value of 0. That's very important. When the foot is on the ground, the rotation of the foot controller should be at 0. So when we're using the heel roll, we have the foot flat on the ground and we're just pivoting that heel off of the ball of that foot, and we're not trying to lift the foot and move it around in order to get that effect. Now conversely, when we lift the foot up off of the ground, we now do not want to use the heel roll at all. So when the foot is up off the ground, the heel roll value should be 0. And if we want to bend or rotate the foot, we should rotate it by rotating the entire controller and not by using the heel roll. This is really, really important because we want to make sure that After Effects in-betweens our key poses correctly. And if we build the key poses and throw in a chaotic, muddy mess between the rotation of the heel and the rotation of the foot controller, and if we get those things muddied together, After Effects will do a very bad job of interpolating those keyframes and we'll get some really bad in-betweens. So just remember, when the foot is on the ground, use the heel roll. When the foot is up off the ground, heel roll is at 0. And also, when the foot is on the ground, that rotation value on that rotation of the foot controller, that should also always be set at 0. So the next controller down the line is the toe roll, which is exactly what you imagine it would be, and that allows you to wiggle the toe up and down there and pose the toe as needed. Now that one you can pretty much use however you want in any situation, although you wouldn't really want to turn it down like this if he's sitting on the ground unless he was at the edge of a cliff or at the edge of a stair step or something like that. So pretty basic stuff there. Okay, so with these basic controls, let's go ahead and create a little bit of animation just so we can see how this process works. And one of the things I want you to notice right away is that on frame 0, I've actually already put keyframes all with neutral values, and then I've added holds to these. I've toggled these to being hold keyframes. Now this is really important because with character animation we want to focus on working pose to pose in most situations. In most situations we want to focus on working pose to pose. And we want to start by really focusing on the poses themselves before we move forward with creating the finessing and the overlap and the follow-through and all the subtleties that will come later. So we want to start with just hold keyframes. So beginning with a 0 frame where you've got keyframes all set at 0 at the neutral position gives you a really good starting place so that now you can move forward. And I'm going to go forward here just by about 1 second. I'm just going to go to 1 second. And I'm going to begin creating my animation there at about 1 second. Having this set of keyframes all at frame 0 all set at the neutral position, and then starting your animation a second or two in gives you a couple of really nice advantages. One of those advantages is that you can copy and paste your neutral keyframes quickly from this set at the beginning in order to reset the character to neutral. And also, if you find out that for some reason you have to back time the animation and slow something down at the beginning, but you don't want to alter every keyframe from here forward, you have a little wiggle room with your timing, a little wiggle room to play around with, which I like to give myself a lot of options when I'm working, so changes aren't very painful. So I'm going to start in here at about 1 second, and what we're going to do is we're going to pose the figure here so that Stretch is just lifting his foot up in the air. Nothing very fancy, nothing very exciting. He's just going to lift his foot up in the air and then set it back down again. Now, as I begin to pose the figure, I'm going to, for the most part, be using the same technique all the way along, which is I'm going to use my regular selection tool here, and I'm going to be clicking and dragging on the controllers, and then I'm going to hold down the W key to toggle to rotation, and then rotate in order to pose the figure. This is an incredibly fast, intuitive way to work and allows you to get your poses settled very quickly. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is begin with this foot. So I'm going to click and drag and lift up this foot. I'm going to hold down that W key and I'll lift the foot up a little bit, and I'm going to pull his toe up a little bit to give it a little cute curly cue up like that. So right away we have a small problem, which is that the character standing on one leg with one leg up and his body weight kind of way over here is clearly out of balance. He would probably fall over forwards if he tried to stand in this position in real life. So what we need to do is we need to rebalance him. And so to do that, I'm going to start by clicking and dragging on the cog and just pull that back a little bit. And I'm going to hold down the W key and rotate him back quite a bit so he's kind of leaning back. And then again, reposition here and make sure that the bulk of his weight is centered over that foot that's supporting the weight. And this leg is overlapping a little too much with his body, and so we're not getting a really nice silhouette there. So I'm going to try to pull that out just a little bit and make that a little better silhouette. Might make me adjust my balance just a little bit there. And I'm going to rotate his foot up just a little bit, holding down that W key. So you can see that this click and drag, holding down the W key to rotate, it's a really efficient and intuitive way to work with your figures. Now, I do a fair amount of clicking and dragging and typing in values in the timeline as well, but most of the time this click and drag and hold down the W to toggle to rotation method is a really, really great way to work. Okay, you'll also notice that because we began with hold keyframes on all of these attributes, as we posed the figure, we automatically created hold keyframes in this nice, neat little column here, and these keyframes make up our key pose. So we now have this very organized pattern here that we can work with. Now this is really important because we're going to be using this basic procedure all the way through this course. So let's go ahead and take the next step and actually add our other two key poses and finish up our animation. We don't actually need all of these attributes to create our animation. We only need these 5 attributes here because that's all we needed to create this pose that we're animating into and then out of. This is, again, a very, very simple movement, but the procedure will stay the same even as we begin working with more complicated motions. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back half a second here. So I'm going to go back here 12 frames. And what we're going to do to create our first set of keyframes in this neutral pose. Now, you wouldn't have to start this animation with a neutral pose, but in this case, all we need is this neutral pose. So all I'm going to do is just select my 5 keyframes here that make up my key pose, and I'm just going to hit the Add Keyframe button for any of these selected attributes. As soon as I do that, I immediately create another column of 5 keyframes that now capture this neutral keyframe value from our hold keyframes at the beginning of the animation here. So there becomes my first key pose in the sequence. Then I can K forward to my second key pose in the sequence. The J and K keys are very handy, particularly for character animation, where you want to jump back and forth between your poses very much in the same way that a traditional hand-drawn animator would flip back and forth between drawings. So we can use the J and K keys, and the way they work is that K will jump forward and J will jump backward, and they will stop on any keyframe or any marker or at the beginning or the end of a work area. I believe they'll also jump to the beginning or the end of the composition as well. So they'll basically jump and stop at any one of those places. K going forward, J going backward. You're going to see me using those keys constantly throughout this course. And then I'm going to jump forward, I'm going to jump forward 12 frames. And now I'm just going to copy and paste those keyframes forward to return to my neutral position. Hey guys, I'm going to break in here and interrupt my own lesson to give you guys an extra special little pro tip here. We're going to be doing a lot of copying and pasting of keyframes, as you just saw me do in the lesson. And in the lesson, I'm just going to be doing it manually. But I wanted to give you guys this little tip. If you download the free Duik animation tools, which I recommend you do anyway, it's free and it's a terrific toolkit for character animation in After Effects. But Duik offers a really, really nice feature here in the animation tab. If you click over to animation, and it's copy and paste animation, and what this allows you to do is actually select keyframes from multiple layers, copy the animation, and then simply paste the animation forward to where your CTI is. This is a massive time saver. Right now we're only looking at a couple layers, but as we continue through these lessons, we're going to be working with dozens of attributes. And once you get working with that many attributes and you want to do this kind of copying and pasting, this copy animation, paste animation function in Duik is absolutely terrific. And just so you know, it'll work with whole sets of keyframes across multiple layers. So I can select that whole group, copy animation, paste animation, and boom, I've recreated those keyframes perfectly with that copy paste. So a little pro tip there, something I recommend you guys do, especially since Duik is free. And if you get really involved with character animation and rigging, you're going to want to have Duik in your toolkit. Okay, back to our lesson. Now at this point, I can create a little RAM preview test. And this is a handy little trick. You can use the N key to bring the end of your work area to your CTI, or conversely, you can use the B key to bring the beginning of your work area right to your CTI. Makes doing RAM previews very quick and handy. And I can begin to get a sense of the timing of my animation. Now, in truth, this movement is so simple that honestly, I barely need to do a RAM preview test to work out the timing. However, in more complicated sequences of animation, this is absolutely a point where you want to stop and RAM preview and begin adjusting your timing. Because here's the thing, without any interpolation, without any finessing, I've got these nice neat, orderly rows representing each of these key poses. So if I decide I want the movement a little faster, I can move the keyframes closer together. If I want the movement slower, I can move the keyframes farther apart. And I can do this all very easily. Now remember, again, when we're working with a more complicated rig, we're going to have dozens and dozens of attributes. So this becomes a very, very critical part of your process. It's important because getting the timing correct this way is going to save you a huge amount of time compared with trying to adjust timing after you've added interpolation and finessing and overlap and follow through and all that kind of stuff. So this is your point to stop and really spend time getting your timing really working well. The other great advantage here is if you have a fairly well educated client, you can actually send your client this kind of a key test and get them to sign off on the basic poses and the basic timing of your animation. This will also save you a huge amount of time because you'll be able to make corrections for your client when you're in this very easy to edit phase before you move forward with the more elaborate finessing and in-betweening. So it's a great way to work. So our timing is looking fine here, so let's go ahead and start in-betweening this animation. So I'm going to be working with each of these key poses as a group in turn. And for right now, we can really pretty much just use simple easy eases and the basic interpolations that After Effects gives us. So we're going to start by selecting the first group of keyframes, and we'll give those an easy ease out. The middle keyframes here, we'll just do a regular easy ease on both sides. And the final set of keyframes will easy ease in. Nice and simple. Now let's go ahead and RAM preview that. And you'll see that we've got a serviceable little piece of animation here, but it's very stiff. It really feels quite mechanical. It doesn't have a real sense of life to it. It feels like some kind of animatronic robot or something. So what we need to do is we need to add that finessing in order to give this a better feeling. So let's go through a little bit of a finessing process with this. Now I want to stress that every animation is going to have a different process for finessing, but there are some basic things that you're going to do in most cases. One of the first things you're going to want to address are your motion paths. So let's take a look at the left foot here, and you can see that our motion path is not very natural at all. One of our 12 principles of animation is arcs, and so we know that human and animal movement, and actually most movement in the world, takes place over some kind of arced trajectory, and a swinging foot would certainly be that kind of a movement. So we're going to want to add some curvature to this motion path. Now, unlike the animation bootcamp and a lot of motion graphics work, we're generally going to leave the position values unseparated for our controllers, and we're going to work with the motion paths rather than splitting the values. Now, there will be times when splitting the values does make some sense, but in general, we're going to want to work with the motion paths. So I usually keep this preference setting for After Effects, default spatial interpolation to linear. I usually keep that checked. That way I'm not dealing with the auto Beziers that After Effects usually wants to add to your motion paths. For character animation, because you want so much control over these motion paths, it's usually better to start with a linear path with no Beziers at all. So I recommend this setting. Now, when we want to add some curvature, now I can add curvature just where I want it and in a very controlled way. So I can click on the actual points on the screen here, but because I've got actually 3 keyframes that are all occupying the exact same position here on the screen, in order to make sure I get the exact keyframe I need, I'm going to actually select it here in the timeline, and then I know I've got the first keyframe of this position moving up and out. Now I'm ready to add my Bezier handle. Now, the way I like to do this, because when we're animating our character, we're almost always using the regular selection tool and then using the W key to toggle to rotation. When I add a Bezier handle, I like to just stay with that same tool, since I'll generally be going right back to using it again. So I use a little double key command here, Command and Option. And when you hold down Command and Option and then hover over one of these keyframes in the composition window, you get the Convert Vertex tool. And now I can take the Convert Vertex tool, which is this little upside down V, and click on that keyframe. And again, because I've selected it here, I know the exact keyframe that I have. And that gives me my little Bezier handle that now I can drag out to add my curvature to this path. Next, I want to add some Bezier handles to this top point, and I'm going to select that. And for this one, I'm going to hold down Command and Option, and because this is a point with both a line coming in and out, I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to click and drag and add those two Bezier handles, and I'm going to first kind of position my curve roughly here, and then I want to once again hold down Command and Option, and then I can break that handle and then pull the downcoming path, that's the path coming back down, pull that into the same position. And I basically want these two to be exactly the same, so I'm going to lay those right on top of one another. Now we're going to come down the other side again, and I'm going to select that position keyframe there. And because this is the end of the movement, I just Command Option click, click, and that adds my Bezier. And now I can click and drag that out to match the curvature up the other side. So now I have a nice curvature moving up and down this movement, something much more natural. So let's RAM preview that quickly and have a look at how that looks. All right, great, that's looking really nice. It's a much more natural movement with that little arcing motion in there. Now the next thing we want to do is add some overlap and follow through. Overlap and follow through is another one of our 12 animation principles, and it's one of the more complicated ones to fully understand and grasp. Luckily, working with animated characters in After Effects or other animation software can make this actually relatively painless. So what we're going to do is add a little simple overlap, follow through, and drag to that foot that's lifting up and putting down. So all we need to do here is look at a couple of different values. We're looking at the rotation value on the toe, and we're looking at the rotation value of the foot itself. What we just want to do to start with is just delay these so we create an offset in what moves first and what moves second. So we want the leg to move first. So remember that the position of the controller is controlling the overall movement of the leg. And we want the rotation of the foot and the toe to drag behind that, to be offset behind that. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the toe roll and the rotation on the foot, and I'm going to drag it back in time, so it's happening after the movement of the position of the foot that moves up to lift the whole leg. So right away we're going to see some overlap and follow through. It's not going to be quite right yet, but you'll see as it comes up and then settles back down, you'll see that we're getting that overlap as the foot comes back down. But we can improve on this quite a bit. The first thing we'll do is we'll offset the toe a little bit more, because we want the toe to be even a little more offset from the foot, so it's dragging behind the foot. And I'll actually do that even quite a bit there. And let's take a look at that. And now you can see as it comes to rest on the bottom, I'm getting a slightly more natural float there. Now, to be honest with you, this is a little bit floaty for more normal animation. It's probably a little slow and floaty, but it's doing a good job of illustrating my point. So you can see now we've got nice overlap and follow through as the foot comes down. Now the reason it's working fine coming down is because we posed the foot pointed upwards here. So it's already pointing in the right direction to drag behind as it comes down. But you'll also notice that it's not dragging, the foot isn't dragging as it comes up. And that's one of the things we want. We want it to drag as it lifts up and then drag as it comes down and overlap as it hits the ground. Now, I could potentially do this in some cases by manipulating the motion graph of the rotation value. Unfortunately, because the foot is starting in basically a flat position, there's probably nothing I can do to crank on that motion graph to get this to really drag behind the way we want it to. So this is a rare instance where I'm going to add a keyframe. Now, this brings up kind of one of my big philosophies when doing character animation, or really any kind of animation using software, and that is that you want to try to work with as few keyframes as possible. Your animation will almost always be smoother, and it'll be easier to edit and revise if you use fewer keyframes. And that's definitely true for character animation. So when I'm in a situation where I think I want to add a keyframe, I will try almost anything to avoid it. I'll try manipulating the motion graph editor. I will try playing around with other controls. I will do different kinds of timing. I'll do anything I can to try to fix the situation without adding another keyframe. I'll do offsetting like we're doing here. But in this case, there's really nothing for it rather than to add a little bit of keying, a couple of keyframes just to drag this foot behind. And it'll still be a nice orderly process here. So I'm going to put the movement right about in the middle here, and I'm just going to click and drag and bend down that foot, and click and drag, and click and bend down that toe. All right, and now I'm just going to offset the toe animation just a little bit to reflect the way we're offsetting the toe all the way through. So toe to the heel here, toe to heel, toe to heel. And now we should have a really nice sense of overlap and follow through. All right, great. Now again, this is probably a little bit exaggerated. It's a little slow and floaty, but I'm exaggerating it for the purpose of really showing you how this process works. Now you can see that after doing this finessing, we don't have such a neat, orderly situation here anymore. Our keyframes are a little bit jumbled up here, but we still built this off of a very solid foundation of structure, and we worked in a very orderly fashion. And in fact, it wouldn't be all that difficult to reposition these keyframes back into their original structure here if we needed to make a change or an alteration. So working very systematically, working in a controlled way, so we really understand what's happening from key pose to key pose and keyframe to keyframe is really essential as you work. Okay, so there's one last thing I want to do to finesse this animation, and that's I want to add a little bit of overlap to the head and body here, or the head body, I guess you could call it with Stretch, since he's sort of got both. And even though we have very few attributes actually driving that part of the animation, we can still add a little bit of overlap here and give our animation just a little more of a natural feeling. So all I have to do here is delay the rotation of the cog a little bit. Once again, the position of the cog is doing the bulk of our work, but if I just delay this rotation in a similar way to the way that I've delayed the rotation of the foot, then we'll get a nice sense of overlap and follow through all the way through the body. Now, one of the things that I'm also doing on purpose here is I'm making sure all of the parts come to rest at slightly different places. So first we have the position of the foot come to rest and the cog position come to rest, and we'll let those sync up. I think that's it's probably good to have those pretty much sync up since they're the major movement of the body. But then we have the foot come to rest a few frames, or excuse me, the cog rotation come to rest a few frames later, then the foot rotation a few frames later, and the toe rotation a few frames after that. That way we get that really natural overlapping finish that we like to see. So let's have a look at our finished animation. All right, great. It's looking really nice and smooth, and a nice sense of overlap and follow through. All right, now this whole time we've been working within a very, very large composition. It's 6000K by 6000K to be exact. Now the reason why that's so large is because we have a character here with raster imagery, and when you have a raster character and you want the character to be able to look good in close-ups, you have to have a lot of pixel depth so that you can drop them into a 1920 by 1080 comp and still get a nice close-up on the face. In extreme situations you can build a whole different rig for the close-ups, but especially when you're working quickly, it's better to create a rig that can do the work of a long shot or a close-up. The other reason the comp is so large is to give the character room to move. We want to be doing the bulk of the movements within the character's rig comp, jumping, taking steps forward and backward. But when we have to do a larger movement, such as walking a character across the screen or jumping or falling off of a cliff, then we're actually going to animate the comp itself inside the scene. So let's take a look at a very, very simple scene setup here, just so we can see how this works. So if you click to 2 leg up render here, you'll see that we have a simple scene setup here. And we've got the stretch rig sitting in the scene, and he's scaled down so that he fits in that scene. Now, this scene could be as complicated or as simple as you like. You could make the layers 3D and add cameras and lights, or you could do a very, very simple composite like we have here. As I was talking about earlier, you're going to be doing what we might refer to as the micro animation of the character itself, his limbs and all of his smaller movements, and even some larger movements like some jumps and maybe a step backward and forward. But if you want this character to walk across the screen, you are literally going to drag this comp across the screen, and you're going to animate the character walking in place. So that's the general setup we're going to be using in most situations, and in most cases this is the optimal way to work. This would be the same thing if you had any kind of large movement. I'm falling over a cliff or anything like that. You're just going to do that macro animation on the character's rig comp inside your scene comp. I'm going to go ahead and just do a little simple RAM preview here. All right, there's our finished scene, all ready to render. Okay, now that we've covered some of the basics, head over to the evaluation exercise video and have a look at what we have set up for you.